Hi, this is Jim from Trek World, and over the years there has been no better example of brand association than what existed between the Mego Toy Corporation and Star Trek in the 1970s. Now, although Mego had only produced Star Trek toys in the mid to late 70s, they are still some of the most desirable toys ever to appear in Star Trek's fandom. So join me after the break as we take a look at the single most iconic line of Star Trek merchandise ever produced. After watching this video, please remember to check out our channel for these other great videos. Also, please be sure to like this video so that YouTube will offer it to more people. Lastly, please consider becoming a VIP supporter via our Patreon site using the link below in the description. Okay, we need to begin this video the right way. Of all of the research that I have ever done for Star Trek video material, I have never encountered so many keepers of the lore as I have when researching Mego toys. And I mean that as a great compliment. That is not sarcasm. The fandom around Mego is one of the most curated repositories that I have ever seen. There are so many websites, forums, channels, groups, photos, and videos that the challenge is not in finding material. The challenge is in figuring out how to pick and choose what material can be used to tell my story. But before we continue, I want to thank these sites for being the standard bearers for all things Mego. Without them, this video would have been a much more different and probably boring video. Now, by the early 1970s, the Mego Toy Corporation established itself as part of the elite vanguard of toy companies here in the United States. Their superheroes line of 8-inch action figures quickly set the standard for what the average action figure would look like pretty much for the next decade. Now, with the success of their original lines, they sought to augment their offerings to include more than just superheroes. And to do so, they looked at movies and TV. They were the first ones to do this for action figure marketing.
Mego presents the Star Trek action figures featuring the crew of the Enterprise, Captain James T. Kirk, their fearless leader, Dr. Bones McCoy, caring for the health of the Enterprise crew, Scotty, the chief engineer, in charge of the transporter room, Mr. Spock, the Vulcan, second in command, and the Klingon.
Did you say Klingon?
Enemy of the Star Trek crew. Star Trek action figures, complete with accessories shown, each sold separately from Mego.
Very quickly, they picked up properties like Planet of the Apes, and not too long after that, they approached Paramount for the rights to license Star Trek toys. Now, when they did, they were caught a little off guard because the deal they got from Paramount actually surprised them. Paramount wanted a 5% royalty on the MSRP of every item they sold, and that's actually fairly standard. It's pretty much the exact same terms that Desilu had offered AMT. What really surprised Mego was, though, that normally when you enter into these kind of agreements, you go into these agreements by paying an advance against royalties, which means, okay, Paramount, I know I'm going to give you 5% of everything that we sell, but what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to give you an advance against that 5%. And you know what? If we sell a lot of them, then I'll be writing you more checks. The folks at Mego were absolutely amazed that Paramount only wanted a $5,000 advance. This really seemed like a deal that was too good to be true. And maybe compared to all of the other licensing they paid, like who knows what they paid Fox for Planet of the Apes. However it worked out, they thought they got a steal with Star Trek. And their timing was impeccable. Despite the fact that the television series had been canceled over 5 years before, Star Trek was beginning to gain popularity more than it ever had before through reruns and the release of the cartoon Saturday morning TV series. Mego capitalized on this success with the historical release of the first 5 Star Trek figures in late 1974. Now, by the time they would be done, they would release a total of 3 different waves of action figures and about 14 different figures. They would also do 2 play sets and a whole bunch of electronic accessories that we're going to take a look at all in future videos. This video, ladies and gentlemen, is specific to what I will call Wave 1, late 1974. The original 5 are out the door. Now, an interesting point that a lot of people have noticed here is although the figures were made to match the visage from the live action series, it is obvious in most of their marketing drawings that they also looked at Star Trek the Animated Series for inspiration. And in all honesty, it sort of makes sense. Remember, dolls were bought by kids, and kids buy what they see on TV. And the most recent thing that they saw in Star Trek were cartoons. So the box art very heavily figured characters that were not photographed, but the models themselves, pretty darn good. Now, as would be the case with a lot of Star Trek collectibles, these things were in very high demand. Now, as a result, they pretty much disappeared by the middle to late 1970s, and the prices had begun to already skyrocket at conventions. Fortunately for the world, they discovered a cache of these in Canada in the early 1980s. And when those dolls hit the market, it actually brought the prices down for the Wave 1 figures and would keep them down for almost a complete decade before they would start to climb to their normal collectible cost levels. Now, the first doll we're going to take a look at here is obviously Captain Kirk. And while these dolls can still be found today, they are getting harder and harder to find. Not to mention that their prices continue to rise. Now, what you're going to see here in a second is the price that one of these dolls recently sold for on eBay within the last like 3 to 4 months. Now, when you go on eBay and you see something like this, maybe you see this doll and the guy wants $1,000 for it. Well, that's really good, but that doesn't mean he's going to get $1,000. And you can't use that valuation to say, oh, because he wants $1,000 for his doll, my doll is also worth $1,000. If you want to establish or how much you should be claiming for insurance reasons or good old bragging, right? You need to always consider the selling price of things, not the listing price. So in this particular case, this doll sold for about $127. Now, as you look for some other ones in eBay, you're going to find the prices go up and down a little bit. This is a really good right down the middle of the road price that'll give you some idea on what your doll is worth or how much it's going to cost you to acquire one. So after Captain Kirk, the next little doll we're going to take a look at, of course, is Mr. Spock. One of the first things you'll notice is Mr. Spock has a tricorder. Remember, Kirk only had the phaser and communicator. Spock added the tricorder. The other thing I want to point out is if you look at the resale price, just as I was able to find a Captain Kirk for about $127 in the past few months, this price of $349.99 pretty much represented the highest price I could find during the same time period that was paid by somebody in order to acquire this doll. So obviously the Spock doll is worth over twice as much as the Kirk doll. Now next up is the Dr. McCoy doll, and like the Spock doll, it also has a tricorder, and like the Captain Kirk doll, it has a value of about $152. Now, next up is Mr. Scott, or Scotty, as they like to point out beside his name, even though they misspelled Scotty. He's an engineer, not a Scottish Terrier. However, they would continue to misspell Scotty throughout the rest of their original 1974 to 1977 run. To make Mr. Scott feel a little bit better, you'll notice that his going resale price is $299.99. And last up, we're going to take a look at the Klingon. Now, the Klingon also had a selling price very much like Mr. Scott's, $299.99. Very strongly desired by Star Trek fans. They did a really good job on this uniform. Now, granted, Klingon uniforms from the original series are not the most elaborate uniforms in the world compared to what they became in Next Generation. But this is actually pretty accurate. I'm impressed with it. Notice that the doll is based off Koloth. It is not based off Kor or Kang. A little bit unusual. I would have sort of thought they would have given the nod to John Calicos's core, but I can also understand that Koloth probably is the most attractive of the three Klingons for sales and marketing promotion. And the other little secret hidden sort of under the covers here is the boots on the Klingon do come off. Captain Kirk, Mr. Scott, Spock, McCoy, those boots are actually part of their legs. They're just one piece. So when they did the Klingon, they actually took the extra step of making the boots be removable, which I thought was a pretty nice touch. It ran up the cost, obviously, of producing the doll, but it served a really good purpose marketing wise. So over the past year or so, I've had several people reach out to me and tell me about how lucky they've been in finding some of these dolls. But quite often, I also hear about people who find them in an opened blister pack. So they'll say, Jim, somebody gave me the backing board and I bought the doll, but how do I know that this is really a wave one? Or what if this is one of the reproductions that have been recently done in the past 10 years or so? It gets very difficult to identify a lot of vintage Star Trek action figures. However, for Wave One, 1974, not so difficult at all. The joints in those dolls were all made from metal, not plastic. So if you have a doll open or still on the blister card, it has metal joints in the wrists, is the most visible one, then you have one of the original five-faced Wave 1 series that was done in late 1974. Hands down, no problem. If you do not, then it is not an original. The other ways that you can tell in the event that it's still marked on the card and you can't see the joint because of positioning for the uniform, you look for a few other things. For one thing, in the top left-hand corner, notice the Star Trek logo is all white against a yellow background. Another thing to notice is a little bit off the right-hand shoulder of the doll, you will see a round white and red Mego logo. That also only appears that way on Wave 1. And then, of course, the most finest telltale sign that you actually have a Wave 1 set is there are only 5 faces on the front and back of the card packaging. So if all 4 of these things are true for you, metal joints, white logo, white and red Mego off the right-hand side of the character, 5 faces on the front, 5 faces on the back, then you have a Wave 1 action figure. If it's still in the box, don't take it out. Trust me. Throughout the 1970s, these little guys were released, and they quickly were becoming scarce in the United States here, and the prices began to creep up. It was not all that unusual to see, even in the late 1970s, these dolls commanding prices of well over $100 a piece, because you couldn't find them in the stores anymore. They seemed to be custom made for the collectibles market, so buy them collectors did. But there was a nasty surprise in the 1980s when a huge cache of these Type 1 Wave 1 dolls were discovered in a warehouse in Canada. So many of them so that when they were released into the market, they immediately brought down the collectible cost of the doll in the hands of every collector that had already purchased them. In fact, it would be well over a decade before this particular influx of dolls finally allowed the Wave 1 dolls to start to stabilize in pricing and rise up in cost again. So that's it. This takes you through the Wave 1 Star Trek 5 doll set produced in late 1974. Please keep an eye open. In the near future, you're going to see us talk about the Wave 2 aliens that were done, Wave 3 aliens that were done but seem to be even more scarce to find than the Wave 2 aliens. And we'll also take a look at the playsets in a special video and the electrical items that Mego produced. And I have to tell you, Mego really went all out when they started doing these electrical accessories. There's some pretty futuristic stuff that we're going to be taking a look at. So once again, this is Jim from Trek World, and I want to thank you very much for spending time with me today as we take a look at this. Please be sure to like this video so that it can be promoted to other people. And until next time, live long and prosper.